Thank you all for coming. If this piece had a title, it might be called something like How Not to Write a PhD. Looking back, it seems on one hand impossible that I ever had the audacity to embark on a sober academic study of the works of Robert Dessaix. And on the other, it seems equally impossible that I ever finished it. For Robert's works are so rich and varied, bursting with digressions and ideas, stories within stories, each one about a wanderer, a traveller, an exile, a tourist. It's a wonder I got past the first book. Conceived solely as a project to calm my own restlessness, I soon found myself within a year alighting a train at Baden-Baden, on the hunt for the house in which Ivan Turgenev lived at close quarters to Pauline Viardot, as we learn in Twilight of Love, carting around in my suitcase the sense that Europe had more to offer me than my own country did. I also found myself reading these 5 books and saying, "Aha, you're my man." While in these same 5 books, there was a writer saying the same thing to other authors, such as André Gide, Turgenev, and Dante. Needless to say, my particular brand of sober academic inquiry was far from sober, and to the great anxiety of my supervisors, probably barely academic. The problem was I was enchanted. I didn't want to retain a cool academic distance. I wanted to plummet down the rabbit hole. I wanted to disappear into these books. There's a knowing voice speaking to you on every page, egging you on, showing you things, suggesting that life is out there somewhere, but telling you that, to quote a mother's Disgrace, radical action is required. I wanted radical action. Something you don't often come across in the muted halls of the School of English, Journalism and European Languages. Hello to all my former colleagues. And so I found myself again in Europe, arriving in Venice for the first time late on a particularly hot September night. I was walking along the Rio Terra San Leonardo, looking for the Hotel Arcadia for night letters, dragging that same suitcase behind me, the one I'd carted around Baden-Baden. A thunderstorm had rolled in across the archipelago. There was no rain yet, but it wasn't far away. I was being introduced to the sinking city by flashes of lightning in the darkness. A cupola here, a balcony lined with geraniums there, the statue of a winged lion. Another bolt of lightning flashed out over the Venetian lagoon, lighting up a spiral staircase in front of me. And standing there in that electric night, I'd stopped walking by now and was looking around. I was struck for the first time by the way stories work in Robert's books. Each story spirals around something, some kind of ineffable figure in the middle. It occurred to me that the project of these 5 books was to tell stories, to build up a bank of stories, of images that said something about belonging, about being at home, about how to be in the world. I'd conceived of my sober academic inquiry as a way of straightening things out, straightening myself out, as well as straightening out the dilemma of these strange books. But what I ended up with was a deeper understanding of coils, spirals and zigzags, of dodging time, of leaving things unplanned, of never following the straight path. I called my project This Mortal Coil, which was, I think, the only thing in about 4 years that my supervisors were impressed by. But rather than being an homage to the British post-punk band from the early 80s of the same name, it was an homage to Robert's work, to the way stories coil around their narrators, girding them and grounding them. These books did not cure me of my restlessness, though they certainly cured me of sober academic inquiries. What they did do was reconcile me to a certain grounded restlessness, They gave me a lineage of journey, a history of being outside. They're not self-help books. You won't find them on the shelves next to a smiling, bespectacled Dalai Lama. Or you might, but someone will be in trouble. Probably me. But like the best books, they offer insight and consolation. They offer liberty. They offer flashes of light in the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Can I say something?
You probably should, actually.
It's thank you, of course. It's wonderful to have someone speak so warmly about books that I've written. I'm intrigued by your word stories because I do not have a strong sense of myself as a storyteller. Mm-hmm. I'm slightly intimidated by the word story, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. And although I do spiral and coil, that's true, I can't quite think of the right word to describe what I think I'm doing when I talk to all these people here. It's not exactly meditating in public. It's not exactly writing a memoir. It's something to do with buttonholing. I think I buttonhole people. And I start not haranguing them, but trying to seduce them in some sense. I think that's what I do. I'm a gossip. I'm an inveterate gossip. But linked stories are not my forte, and I'm always very impressed by people who can do it. Do you remember a writer called Marion Halligan?
Yes.
Marion, I knew because she went to the ANU as I did. I used to say to Marion, you know, if I just said to you the word tea towel or geranium, you could write a story. And she would pluck it out of some world of her imagination, and there it would be. I can't do that. I simply can't do that. You have to help me if you want me to spin something. You have to give me the thread. You have to perhaps not exactly suggest the pattern that I should weave, but I need your help. You have to be there, or I have to imagine that you're there.
This is what you're doing when you're writing.
Yes.
Yes.
Whereas Marion could just come up with a story. I mean, many people can. Many writers can. And I don't think that's exactly what I'm good at. I mean, Tolstoy used to say he had no imagination, which is not true, of course, he did. But Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and one or two others we might think of, in a sense also did not come up with stories in quite the way some writers can. They needed a prompt.
And travelling is that prompt often.
It often is.
It's got that nice...
Well, I don't know what you all think about travel, but when I leave home, as I'm going to do tomorrow morning, as a matter of fact, and go to Hobart Airport and take off into the blue or the grey or whatever it is tomorrow, you leave something behind, don't you? Something that doesn't imprison you, but it does drop a template over you, I think. And when I leave, I cast off the template. And so there's a kind of a liberation, and that allows my eyes to see and my ears to hear, and I start to tell myself stories, by which I do not mean truths, of course.
No. Well, your first book begins with a quote from Jeanette Winterson. I'm telling you stories. Trust me is the second bit. We might come back to that bit in a moment. But then you open with the story at Groppies.
In Cairo, yes. Well, you see, that really happened to me, and that was while travelling. And yes, every day when I travel, some of you will do the same thing. Regardless of how tired I am, I go back to my room and I write something in a book. I never keep a diary at home here in Hobart. I write a note sometimes. If someone says an interesting word to me, I go home and write it down, or a little idea about something that I might have had while walking the dog, usually. But when I travel, before I go to sleep, I write 1 or 2 pages. And then when I get home, sometimes these pages blossom.
Into books.
Yes.
Mm.
Well, Night Letters is a good example.
Mm.
Corfu is a good example. But I need it. I can't just sit at home and dream up worlds the way some people do. I can't do it. It's not what I'm good at.
No. Well, if you say so. I'm not agreeing. But A Mother's Disgrace was an attempt to perhaps tell us a kind of story about where you came from.
The first book, yes, it was, because I had someone to tell it to. And I do think that's important when you tell a story. You need a voice, but you need someone to tell the story to. Otherwise, you're just talking into the ether. You're just sort of blabbing. And I said this before, and I'll say it again, because some of you write or want to write. When I joined the ABC said to me, there is no such thing as Australia. Never speak to Australia. It's not there. Choose someone and speak to this friend, this woman, this man. Well, of course, it's always, for me, much more interesting to speak to a woman, because I feel she's going to say something really interesting back. So I do.
I apologise in advance.
And her name is Susie. At the moment, it started off being Andrea, actually. But yes, in that book, I was explaining to the mother I had just met at the age of 45 who I was and why I wasn't what she'd hoped for. Because I wasn't, and she told me when she met me. She would have preferred I worked in Westpac and had a proper job.
That must have been confronting, given that you're perhaps the opposite of that.
I just leapt over it, really. And I didn't let it confront me, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew right from the start that I wasn't what she would have hoped for. It wasn't that she didn't like me, but she made it very clear, and I talk about that in A Mother's Disgrace, that if she'd kept me, I would have turned out better. And I certainly wouldn't have been you know what.
A writer. Zigzagging. You in Night Letters. This is a thing you keep coming back to in Night Letters. Oddly, is the idea of unplanned journeys. Can you explain to us why zigzagging? Why not plan out a journey and stick to the itinerary?
Well, you have to plan a bit, don't you? But at some sort of deeper level, more metaphysical level, I suppose, and it comes up in the on the second last page of the last book, it's still there, this refusal to move in a straight line. I feel that if you move in a straight line, you will hit the wall and die. Why do that?
No.
So I see the wall, I know it's there, I'm not pretending it isn't there. I'm going to hit it. You'll hit it, everyone here will hit it. But I'm not going to go straight for it. So I zigzag, and I spiral, and I go up, and I go down, and I try to find another way of inching forward. And I do it in life, and I do it when I travel, and in some ways I probably do it in the books, don't you think? I mean, the books don't start with a scene and just move in an orderly fashion towards a resolution of something. They just don't. It's not how my mind works, it's just not how it works. To me, that is mortality, that is death.
Yes. I noticed that just this time going through the books again, that A Mother's Disgrace finishes with you saying, well, I don't really know how to finish. I could finish like this, or I could finish like this. I don't want to provide you with a neat ending to this. And then Night Letters starts with, well, I don't really know where to begin.
But we're all in the middle of a great splodge, is what I think. Everybody is in the middle of a great splodge. And the point is to enjoy the splodge you're in.
You're skipping ahead to the new book. We'll get to it. We've got 4 more books to go. And then Corfu. Shall we talk about that for a little bit? That's one of my favourites.
Why?
Because not a lot happens, and yet it's still interesting.
Like life.
That's true, actually. Yeah. Okay. Twilight of Love. You or your narrator will stick with Corfu. Can you tell us a bit about Kester Berwick?
Just a little. Kester Berwick was a complete nobody, and he lived in Adelaide and had theatrical proclivities. He was also a bit like that. And I find Adelaide interesting, and I found Kester Berwick interesting. I find nowhere places interesting, and people who have kind of missed the train. It's interesting, because I feel at some level in my own life, you wouldn't think so probably. I'm out the front, you're not. But actually, I feel I've missed a whole lot of trains, and I'm standing on the station. I'm just there, and I'm of no great importance. And ordinariness interests me. And the reason I wrote Corfu was to explore 2 things. One was ordinariness, and how to magnify yourself so that you don't feel ordinary to yourself. Who cares what Beyoncé thinks of me? I mean, I don't suppose she gives a lot of thought, but, or Tony Abbott, or anybody really. What is important is how I feel about myself. I know I'm of no importance. Therefore, it's important for me to look at someone like Kester Berwick, who came from Adelaide, and, you know, did this and that in the amateur theatre scene in Adelaide, and then when lived in Greece, Athens, ended up living in Corfu, lived not far from where my cousin lives. I saw the house he lived in, and I thought, you're my man, as you thought about me. You are artistic, you have travelled a lot, yet it doesn't really, I'm awfully sorry, Kester, add up to anything very much. I'm fascinated by that. It's very easy to write a book about Tolstoy, to write a book about Balzac, to write a book about Napoleon. But if you want to write a book about me, or you want to write a book about Kester Berwick, it's not so easy, because nothing really adds up to anything very much. Yet that's the situation almost everybody in this room is in. And so we have to think about how to find ourselves beautiful regardless. So that's what that book is about. And it's also about friendship, of course, which is an abiding theme in my books. And it's about the edges of friendship where it can shade into erotic feeling. Why does it when it does? Why doesn't it when it doesn't? So, in other words, it's about varieties of intimacy, I suppose. And what else is there that really makes sense except intimacy? I mean, we use the word love usually, but intimacy is the thing that enriches my little life, my minor life. It is a minor life. It's intimacy, because when I'm being intimate, in whatever way it might be, and there are so many ways of being intimate, as you know, then I am big, and I matter. And Kester Berwick matters, I think, by the end of Corfu. It's also my most literary book, I think. In fact, it's a little bit too literary. I reread it. I don't reread myself. I get terribly embarrassed when I have to reread something of my own. But I reread it and I thought, you're trying perhaps a little bit too hard here and there. But
it's worth putting the effort in, though. Don't you think?
What do you mean, in general, or?
In writing. writing?
Oh yes, it is. But I think sometimes I what would you say, over-determined the course of things in Corfu. But in some ways, it's my favourite book. And it's the book I get most letters about.
I do.
Yes? And it's the book critics were rudest about.
Well, we don't listen to critics.
Oh, we do, you know. Yes, we
What
do.
did Martin Amis say? A bad review should ruin your breakfast but not your lunch.
All very well for Martin Amis. I remember every single word that two men who shall remain nameless, the critic of the Age and the critic of the Sydney Morning Herald, said about Corfu. Of course you do. I don't remember all the nice things people said, but I remember what they said.
Yeah.
Peter Craven is one name that sort of floats across
Suggest.
my field of vision. Here, Andrew Ream is another. I wish them well.
While we're talking of friendship, Twilight of Love,
Yes,
Turgenev and Pauline Viardot.
yes.
What was going on there?
Between those two,
Yes.
it's a very beautiful thing that we don't hear about very often. I think it's about a man, Turgenev, who was, of course, a member of the gentry in Russia, born in the second decade of the 19th century, who went to the theatre one night in St. Petersburg and fell in love with the French-Spanish opera singer Pauline Viardot, and stayed in love passionately. He used the word passionately, strasna in Russian, which is a strong word, with Pauline Viardot all his life until the minute he died. Very close to her, actually, just in a room very close to where she lived. He never wavered. There were sometimes years when they did not see each other. I found this very beautiful, particularly because, as far as anybody knows, and believe me, people have tried to find out, there was no sexual contact whatsoever. I find that, of course, a little bit hard to picture in these years that we inhabit in the early 20th century, where everything is so heavily sexualized so quickly. It isn't that there were no sexual feelings, it's that that was not what the relationship was anchored in. And this is beautiful. And I thought, if I could understand that better, because it is so of another world, a world I no longer can live in, if I could understand it better, I would understand certain things about passions of my own, which are not actually rooted in sexual feelings. Yet when we watch television, when we go to the movies, when we read books written recently, but even, well, anything French really, whenever it was written, everything is rooted in some sort of desire for a sexual relationship of some kind. And there's nothing wrong, of course, in a sexual relationship or in desire. I'm not a Buddhist in that sense of thinking that all desire is to be poo-pooed, by no means. But there are other kinds of passions, other kinds of intimacy, other kinds of great love. And so that's why it interested me. Also, it's Russia, and I had written not so very much about my great, is it a love? Russia, is Russia a love? Was Russia a love? Was it a love? It was more what I would call an amour.
The difference being?
Well, if you don't know, you probably don't need to.
I'll look it up.
I wanted to write about this country which has taken up so much of my mind, of my thoughts, so many of my thoughts over my entire life, really. I started learning Russian when I was a little boy. I wanted to write about it, but of course you must find someone to write it through. And so here in Tasmania, through a Russian friend, I thought, yes, Turgenev. Turgenev is the man. He wrote the most beautiful Russian there is, apart from Pushkin, who was really basically a poet. Turgenev was not. And so his Russian is simply a joy, and it works beautifully in English. I think the translations are very beautiful. So I went to Russia and I followed in his footsteps.
And you talk about how he had this, well, not in Russia, but in France, he had this sense of having come home. Was that something that you could identify with at that time?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I haven't come home to France. I've been going to France quite a lot, and again, I started learning French when I was a very little boy. I mean, my father insisted that I learn it, and I did. But home, really, for me, is Peter Tim's. It's not a place. I'm at home when I'm with Peter Tim's. And the dog, of course. I mean, you can imagine. I would be at home in Khartoum. I would be home anywhere, really. So long as it's not very far away, with Peter Tim's. I don't have to see Peter Tim's, but I have to feel that I'm grounded in Peter Tim's. But some places, of course, open up around you. Well, you used the word rabbit hole. They're like rabbit holes. You can dart down, and there, in this subterranean space, is a whole universe. And France is like that, Russia is like that. It doesn't work, for example, in Finland for me. It just doesn't. What's the name of the composer? Exactly, Sibelius. You see, nothing happens.
But not in an interesting way.
Nothing happens. It's a lovely country, lovely people.
Yeah.
They drink a lot of milk, actually, which I like. Oh, yes.
Cow's milk.
Cow's milk. You can have a glass of milk with your lunch, if you like, in the university restaurant. There, I spent 6 months there once. Milk, wherever you looked. But it's very flat.
It's very flat.
And nothing happens inside. But in France and in Russia, something happens inside. And now, of course, in India.
Yes.
I am amplified. That's what you want, isn't it?
That's what I want.
One wants.
One wants. Yes.
You weren't amplified in France. You went there about 2 years ago and you weren't amplified, were you?
I was not.
No.
No. But I was in Nice, which is the Gold Coast
It is really, yes.
of France.
Yes, now you have to go maybe to further up into Provence or to the Dordogne or somewhere like that, yes. Anywhere really, but not so much Nice. Nice is picturesque. But we get picturesque everywhere. But Tasmania has picturesque.
Yes.
Sandy Bay is picturesque. It's picturesque, believe me, it's picturesque.
Sure.
Try Calcutta if you want to see something that isn't picturesque. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes, oh good. Sometimes you hear. Oh really? Am I fading? Oh, am I? Sorry, Mary. I know who you are. I'll try harder.
And so, well, let's talk about Arabesques for a bit,
Mm.
and then we'll maybe skip forward to the pleasures of leisure.
These are all the backlist, which has just been republished by Zoom publishers.
Yes.
Bless them.
Thank you. for
Thank
doing
you.
that.
And thank you, Adam, because it was Adam who noticed that I was bit by bit going out of print. And so I had to go and find someone who would like to bring me back to life. And it was Zoom, and they gave me funky new covers.
They look excellent.
I've never been thought of as funky before.
Not as far as you're aware.
Not as far as I'm aware. No.
Yes.
Arabesques.
Well, it's so important that these books are in print, I think.
Thank you.
It is.
Well, it's good, nice for them to feel that they're there, but of course most writers have to accept that bit by bit, yes, they will disappear. It's all right, but I'm delighted, I'm thrilled.
Good, good. As are we.
Thank you. Arabesques.
Arabesques. So talking about bit by bit falling away, we have André Gide, something falling loose when he arrives at a hotel in, oh God, I spent years with this book. I can't remember. Cairo? He writes his name on the board.
No, it's in Algeria.
It's Algeria.
Yes, but it's not Algiers. Just south of Algiers. Yes. Well, I wrote about André Gide because this is another example of how my mind works. When I was 16, I used to work in a bookshop every Christmas for about 6 years. £6 a week I got. Girls got £5 a week. I got 6. And it was a most wonderful education. It was Angus and Robertson in Sydney, in Castlereagh Street in the old days when they had wooden shelves. I worked there every Christmas from the time I was about, I think, 14 actually. And it was wonderful. I don't regret it for a moment. But I came across André Gide in the foreign section. We had a wonderful Austrian woman in the foreign section who whose eye I caught, and she would offer me things to read. And she gave me The Immoralist, of all things, at the age of about 16 or 17, to read. And it's a wonderful book if you come from Lane Cove, as I did, where words like immoral, well, immoral, of course, existed, but not words like immoralist. And I read The Immoralist, and I thought, you've got something to teach me. You're talking to a side of myself which hasn't yet started to breathe. It's just, do you say in utero? Is that what you say in English? But it hasn't started to breathe yet. You're talking to me about North Africa. You're talking to me about sexuality of a kind which nobody talked about, of course, in the 1950s. Not really, not allowed. But the interesting thing to me about André Gide, I hope you understand what I mean when I say this, is that he was a Protestant. And he was a Protestant in a very Catholic part of France, the northwest of France. And I found this fascinating because I've always felt that I'm a very Protestant person. And I really wrote the book not so much to tell anyone anything about André Gide. You can find out anything you want to know about André Gide by reading one of the wonderful biographies, there are several, or by reading André Gide. It's easy. I'm actually writing, strange though it may be, about what it means to be a Protestant, because it's very different from being a Catholic, there having been only 2 possibilities in the Australia that I was born in. And so that's what that book is really about.
It's about double lives. What do you think is
double
necessary
lives.
for living a double life?
Courage, of course. I don't think there's anything devious about having a double life. I think it's a good thing to do. You can set up a dialogue between your 2 selves, or your 3 selves, or your 10 selves, however many selves there are. Double I know means 2, of course I know, but I think it's important not to be singular. Have you got a double self?
I think so.
Good. You'll go far. You know what I mean, don't you?
I do. I know exactly what.
Because if you're just a single self, there's no dialogue.
No.
Nothing can move very much. You can just listen to what is said around you. But as soon as there are 2 selves, 3 selves, 4 selves, then things start to move in very interesting ways. And of course, I have 2 or 3 different selves. And one of the reasons I travel is always to play out these selves a little without anyone I know being able to watch. Can't do that in Hobart. You so much as blow your nose in Sandy Bay, someone rings up and tells you they saw you blowing your nose this morning outside the post office.
Yes. Best to stay inside.
How does anyone ever have an affair in Hobart? I can't imagine.
I don't know. We'll throw it open to
What was that?
Change your car.
Quick, write it down. Write it down.
A double car.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I guess we could call these books your European books. I was going to say novels, but they're not really novels, are they?
But in each of them, and this is important, I come home at the end.
Yes.
Home, I think, is one of the most important words in the language. Some of you will, I'm sure, agree with me. Home is one of the richest words. It's one of the most layered words. And I believe very strongly that unless home is good, you can't travel well. I learned that particularly, or it was put very well, by Enid Blyton. After your adventures up the faraway tree, you must come home for tea. And that's what that means. You must come home for tea. And so at the end of each of my books, I come home for tea.
There's also Ogden Nash as well.
What does he say?
Home is heaven and orgies are vile, but you need an orgy once
in a while. That's right, yes. Exactly. Well, yes, don't I use that as an epigraph somewhere?
Yeah,
yes,
in Arabesques.
Arabesques, that's right, of course. I thought I'd recognize it.
So, your European novels, books, and since then it seems that you haven't been much interested in Europe.
I've gone Indian.
You have gone Indian. Is there an explanation for that?
I started to feel, I don't know if any of you will agree with me, I mean, some of you will know what I mean at least. I started to feel a little bit as if Europe is like my grandparents. I'm really fond of them, and they've got really interesting photo collections, but I don't care if I don't see them all that often anymore.
I get it.
You get it?
I get it. Yeah.
I want to go somewhere.
It's not blowing your frock up.
It's not blowing my frock up. I want to go somewhere where I become young again. I want to go somewhere that brings out, as a friend of mine said recently, the kid in me. Wouldn't think there was one, but there is, you know. And I find going to India at the moment, I mean, it might change. I have found for the last 5 years, going to India stimulates me in a way that going to France or Germany or England or Italy or Spain does not. Wonderful places, rich. But I am not reborn.
Is it the landscape? Do you think? It's very awesome in
well, the Himalayas, of course, yes, are sublime. And one looks for the sublime, don't you think? That mixture of fear and wonder that one finds so rarely in everyday life, naturally, otherwise it wouldn't strike you when you found yourself 18,000 feet up somewhere. There's someone at the back of the room who knows precisely what I'm talking about when I talk about the sublime of the Himalayas, because he goes there too. But it's other things in India. It's the way that they treat religion as a kind of refined form of play, rather than as a truth narrative in the way we do.
So you need to behave in a certain way, but it's okay.
And observe certain rituals, and carry out certain duties towards your religious community, and say the right thing, and dance and sing. But you're not talking about truth in quite the same way as in Europe we expect, what would you call them? Teachings of any kind to do. You don't, I have tried this, you don't ask an Indian in quite the same way as you might ask a Christian. And I've tried asking more than one Indian actually, do you believe that Shiva actually sleeps with Parvati? You would have seen last night on Joanna Lumley, Shiva being put to bed with Parvati. Well, I also went and watched last year Shiva being put to bed with Parvati, and I asked my guy, do you believe that Shiva is going to bed with Parvati? Do you really believe this? Do you believe it in the same sense that you think that Budapest is the capital of Hungary? And she said, well, that's not a question that any Indian would ask himself. It is the wrong question. This is what I observe. This is what I do. This is my joy. This is my joy. But if you say to a Christian, do you really believe that Jesus is your Saviour? He will probably, not every kind of Christian, I suppose, but most kinds of Christians will feel morally obliged to answer, yes.
So there's room for these double lives.
Oh, lots of lives. The gods have them. The gods have tens of thousands of lives, because if you follow the Hindu notion that, in fact, there is only one presence reflected in tens of thousands of facets with different names, of course, many of which you know, all the people in this room know these names, whether it's Vishnu or whether it's Parvati or whether it's Krishna or whatever the name is. The divine presence has many selves, and I can have many selves. It's permitted. Here, in our society, I feel I'm in danger of being looked on as a hypocrite if I admit to having more than one self.
Yeah, why is that? We're not allowed to be contradictory. If we find someone stepping out of line, all their dignities are cast aside, and we can...
Well, at some level, I think in Christianity we believe that God is looking at our real self, and he would like us to really act it out.
Sounds like a big job, really.
Well, it's one you've obviously given up on a while ago.
Yeah.
But yes, some people here tonight will still be trying, and that's great.
So, one final...
I say that kindly, by the way. I mean, I know Adam well.
One final thing before maybe we take a few questions.
Yes.
Excuse me. I see that there's a bit of a shift. The European novels, books, looked at mortality, and I think now that you're more writing about time, say in The Pleasures of Leisure, it's more about time. I know time is related to mortality, of course, but it's more about being in time rather than worrying about time running out, I think.
I'm older, you see. I understand and I accept that time is running out. I don't need to keep talking about it. But when I was diagnosed with HIV, of course, and faced with this diagnosis, I was given 5 years at the time, that was something I had to deal with by writing a book. That's how I dealt with that. And so, of course, there is quite a lot about how to live a beautiful life, given that you will stop living shortly. Then I had the heart attack, and I wrote a book, What Days Are For, which, again, is not a dark book. These are not dark books. I think these are happy books.
I think so too.
I'm not trying to teach anyone anything. I'm simply trying to say, you know, I've looked straight at these things, as most people here have in some form or other, some more than I have, and I'm finding a way to still live a beautiful life. So I don't have to keep talking about that exactly. I've moved on to how to play with time. It will always own me. But the thing about the last book, The Pleasures of Leisure, is it's about how to, as much as possible, be master of your own time. I'm not all that good at it, but I'm trying. That's what it's about answering back to time, about taking control of it, about not being a slave to those who would try to, what would you say, straitjacket us in a capsule of time. So you're right.
Thank you. Can I introduce you to my supervisor?
No.
Maybe. Okay. Maybe we'll have some questions. Does anyone have a question or two? Yes.
I
Yes, you're right. I decided a long time ago that that's not what I'm good at. I get a bit shouty if I start to talk about politics. So, although I might in certain, around certain tables, or after watching things on television, or both Peter and I shout at the television quite a lot. And we shout at the radio, or I shout at the radio as well. But I'm not a clear political thinker, so I leave it to people who are. I mean, I think you should, if you want to write, or you want to write songs, or you want to write music, or whatever it is you might want to do as an artistic endeavour, I think it's really good if you ask yourself honestly, what am I good at? And what am I not so good at? I'm good at, I think, other things. I think I'm good at inviting other people to go along with me. I'm not good at teaching them things. They may wish to learn, but I'm not good at teaching. And so I try to stay away from those things. Of course they depress me. What can I say? But I mean, if I go to India and see people dying on Charingi in the middle of Calcutta, where they lie overnight, thousands of people sleeping and some will die, particularly in winter. In Russia, when I lived in Russia, the concentration camps still existed. And I would get up in the morning at the university, and the first thing I would think every morning as I looked out the window into the dark particularly was, at this instant, people are dying in concentration camps in this country now. But what can I do? What can I do? Someone can do many things. What can I do but try to be a good human being and live out certain values? That's my way of coping. And it is not to try and take these things on. I do not have the solutions.
I was just curious because you seem to be a person that thinks a great deal and observes life, and I just hear so much about people's levels of thinking about these issues and stress. And
But there are so many people who know so much more, you see.
Yeah, I understand that. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any question? Yes.
Robert, you say you're not a teacher, but the best teachers are the ones that draw it out of their students, pupils, audience, or whatever. And what you do for me is pull out from within me things I really know but have never been able to articulate. And I spend a lot of my time reading your book saying, oh, of course, yes, I knew that, but I could never have said it like that.
Well, I'm tickled, Peter. Thank you. So I'm like a magnet, aren't I? I draw these things.
Anyone else got questions or compliments? Oh, yes.
I just want to know.
Oh, hang on. We've got one here and then far away.
I just want to know whether or not all of your different selves actually speak to one another.
Perhaps not as much as they should. It's a very good question. They quite often go and play in their own playground, to be quite honest, but they should. And in my fantasy land, about which I write in A Mother's Disgrace, this land, which is divided in two, which I've written about in A Mother's Disgrace, which has a language, which has cities, railways, airline timetables, schools, hospitals. The two sides of the island do speak to each other, and this is obviously the embodiment of something deep inside me, which is riven. And the two parts do try to talk to each other, those two parts, but there are more than two parts. One side of me is very liberal, and one side of me, I suppose, wants to wants people to be good. I have no right to insist people be good in my sense of the word. And I've lived in the Soviet Union where people were forced to be good in a particular way. It doesn't work, of course, but nor does absolute liberality. So, as I get older, I think maybe I'm turning into porridge more. That's probably a good thing. There's a
We have
man.
a question up the back. Do we need a microphone?
No. What a day's for was my book, really very relevant to me. But in it, you made a comment that you haven't seen anybody in thongs and shorts at the TSO. Yeah.
Do I say that? Do I?
Tasmanians didn't go to the TSO in shorts and thongs. Does that yet happen?
First of all, I deny having ever said it. But secondly, it's true, isn't it? But really, Peter and I are more Musica Viva people, so I can't speak with any authority about the TSO. Although not being able to speak with authority about something has never stopped me speaking, I have to say.
It's more an attitude, isn't it?
It is, it's an attitude.
Helen.
I think your work is marked by humility on the one hand and ambition on the other. Is there any topic that you've ever had to give up on?
Apart from well, politics, yes, I have, I suppose. I don't know that I write about sex very well, do I?
You spiral around.
I spiral around it. I'm afraid, you see, and this is the absolute truth. I mean, I think about sex quite a lot. Sex is very important to me, and it's a form of intimacy that I think is, well, it's been given a bad name that it doesn't deserve. But I'm embarrassed about what many of the people I see here now would think of me if I wrote what I really think. And so I haven't quite solved that problem. Well, of course, I never write about sport.
What's that?
I don't know that I've ever... I mean, we had to play cricket and football at school, but I stopped playing cricket, actually. I can't see any point in standing there and having someone throw a hard object at your private parts, which is what cricket is, basically. Football we had to play every year, but I have no memory of it, really. I never knew which end of the field was mine. What else have I not written about? What do you think I should have a go at? But ideologies I'm not good at. I know that's true. I get, as I said, shouty.
May I ask, what about science?
Science?
Or any of your science?
That's true. No, I don't write about science. I mean, I'm ignorant, really, of science. I never studied it at school. Well, I did for 3 years in high school, but I don't know anything about it, really. I think I have quite a rational mind. I don't think I'm a romantic. I think fairly logically about things. But it doesn't excite me. It's not reality that interests me, but the relationship to reality of human beings that interests me, how people cope with reality. So I leave that to other people. You're quite right. Science, I haven't. No, there are people who do. I mean, Sue Wolfe, the Sydney writer, she does science. I don't know. Do many fiction writers, for example, excel at it? I'm not sure. But you're quite right. I don't write about science, physical sciences. Metaphysics interests me.
Maybe one more? Yes?
If I was going to pick one of your books for a book club that I belong to, which book would you recommend? I have not read your work.
Which one do we have
Well, the ones that have done really well are A Mother's Disgrace. Of course, that's read in schools in some places, and that was my first book, but that slightly depresses me. I always feel, as other writers here tonight will feel a little depressed when people say, you know, the book of yours I love most is A Mother's Disgrace. Makes me feel it's been downhill all the way since then. But there's a lot to talk about. It's about mothers. It's about homelands. It's about Russia. The other book that's read in schools is Night Letters. And it's colourful and it's about things that are important.
There's also a play.
There is a play, but there is a play of Night Letters. I didn't actually write it. It's been on here in Hobart, actually, at Rosny College. And I think at what is the Catholic College? Guildford Young, which surprises me. I have to say, I can't imagine how that was let pass. But I did say to an Indian woman in Sydney who brought along her class to hear me speak in Sydney, and who said to me, you know, all these boys have just read Night Letters. And they were from a Marist Brothers college. And I said, well, what do the brothers think about that, you know, given what goes on in this book? And she said, the brothers don't know. So there's those two. But for a book club, I mean, What A Day's For is a book that, depending on the age group in your book club, What A Day's For is probably one that generates talk. I mean, what you want is not a book that I like, or that even they like. It's a book that's going to generate good talk, isn't it? And that probably would as well. Whereas Arabesques and the Turgenev book, Twilight of Love, they're appealing to something a little deeper, probably, in the reader, and would hope for some desire, at least, to read some Gide, to read some Turgenev. That could work in a book club, I suppose, as well. But you all want to go home and have dinner, don't you, really? I can tell by the look on your faces.
We'll wrap it up then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. Would you all... Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.